December 7th, 1941. 0600 hours. 230 miles north of Oahu. Vice Admiral Chui Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, watching the final preparations for what Japanese naval planners believed would be the decisive blow against American naval power in the Pacific. Through the pre-dawn darkness, 6 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers prepared to launch 353 aircraft in the most audacious naval aviation attack in history. The mathematics of surprise were carefully calculated. American radar installations were primitive and limited. Hawaiian air defenses consisted of obsolete fighters and inadequate warning systems. Most importantly, Japanese intelligence assured Nagumo that the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers were safely in harbor, soon to be destroyed alongside the battleships. What Nagumo couldn't know, what no Japanese planner had anticipated, was that this devastating surprise attack would trigger a revolution in naval warfare that would render Japanese defensive calculations meaningless. Within months, American carrier task forces would appear in waters the Imperial Navy considered absolutely secure, launching airstrikes from directions Japanese radar couldn't detect, at times enemy intelligence never predicted, against targets the Homeland Defense System wasn't designed to protect. The transformation began in the burning wreckage of Pearl Harbor itself. As Japanese aircraft departed Hawaiian waters, leaving behind 8 battleships sunk or damaged, they had achieved tactical perfection. Yet Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood immediately that Japan had awakened something far more dangerous than they had destroyed. The American aircraft carriers Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga had escaped the attack, delivering fuel and aircraft to remote Pacific bases. These 3 ships, seemingly insignificant compared to the massive battleships now settling into Pearl Harbor's mud, represented a threat Japanese strategic planners had fundamentally miscalculated. Japanese naval doctrine, refined through decades of careful study, assumed that decisive fleet actions would occur within predictable operational areas. Their defensive perimeter strategy depended on early warning systems that could detect approaching enemy forces hundreds of miles from potential targets. Island bases equipped with reconnaissance aircraft would provide surveillance of vast ocean areas. Radio intercept stations would monitor enemy communications. Most critically, Japanese planners assumed that American carrier operations would follow conventional patterns, approaching targets from expected directions at anticipated speeds. The reality proved catastrophically different. American carrier task forces possessed operational flexibility that Japanese defensive systems couldn't accommodate. Unlike the massive battle fleets that required extensive logistic support and moved along predictable routes, carrier groups could appear anywhere within a 1,000-mile radius, launch devastating attacks, and disappear before Japanese forces could respond effectively. January 1942 brought the first hints of this new reality. American carriers Enterprise and Yorktown conducted raids against Japanese installations in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands. These attacks, while causing limited physical damage, revealed operational capabilities that contradicted every assumption Japanese planners had made about American naval limitations. The carriers had approached from unexpected directions, launched coordinated strikes against multiple targets, and withdrawn before Japanese reinforcements could arrive. More disturbing still was the realization that Japanese early warning systems had provided virtually no advance notice. The radar installations protecting these forward bases, primitive by later standards but representing Japan's most advanced detection technology, had failed to identify the approaching American task forces until aircraft were already overhead. Radio intercept stations had detected no unusual communications. Reconnaissance patrols had reported nothing suspicious. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, analyzed these early American raids with growing concern. His confidential report to the Naval General Staff, declassified only decades later, captured the emerging threat with remarkable prescience. The American carriers demonstrate operational methods we did not anticipate. They approach from directions our reconnaissance cannot cover. They coordinate attacks with precision our intelligence indicated they lacked. Most concerning, they disappear before our surface forces can engage them. We are fighting an enemy whose capabilities exceed our strategic calculations. February 1942. Intensified Japanese concerns when American and Australian forces began coordinating carrier operations in ways that stretched defensive resources beyond their limits. While Japanese attention focused on consolidating gains in the Dutch East Indies and preparing for advances toward Australia, Allied naval forces conducted a series of hit-and-run attacks that demonstrated the futility of Japan's perimeter defense strategy. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 would provide the first full demonstration of American carrier capabilities that Japanese planners had dismissed as impossible. For the first time in naval history, major fleet units engaged in battle without ever coming within sight of each other. Aircraft from carriers hundreds of miles apart conducted coordinated attacks that revealed tactical sophistication. Japanese intelligence had assured their commanders the Americans didn't possess. More shocking than the tactical execution was the strategic implications. American forces had appeared in the Coral Sea at precisely the moment when Japanese attention was focused elsewhere. The timing wasn't coincidental. It represented operational planning that coordinated multiple carrier task forces across thousands of miles of ocean, achieving tactical surprise against an enemy who believed they controlled the initiative. Japanese radar technology, which naval leaders had assumed would provide adequate early warning, proved catastrophically inadequate against carrier-based aircraft approaching. The primitive from unexpected vectors detection systems could identify large formations of aircraft at ranges of perhaps 50 miles under ideal conditions. Against small groups of carrier aircraft approaching at low altitude from multiple directions, the radar provided virtually no useful warning. Even more problematic was the command and control system that connected radar stations to defensive fighters. Japanese air defense doctrine assumed that incoming raids would follow predictable patterns, allowing commanders time to coordinate responses. American carrier aircraft, however, appeared over targets with timing that made coordinated defense impossible. By the time radar operators identified incoming aircraft, directed fighters toward intercept courses, and communicated target information, the American planes had completed their attacks and begun withdrawing. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots and ground crews proved as devastating as the physical damage. These men had trained extensively for air combat, but their preparation assumed they would face enemy aircraft under circumstances that allowed them to utilize their superior experience and equipment. Instead, they found themselves responding to surprise attacks by aircraft that appeared without warning, struck with devastating effectiveness, and disappeared before effective counterattacks could be mounted. Wing Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced fighter pilots, described the frustration in his post-war memoir. "We were excellent pilots flying superior aircraft, but we couldn't fight enemies we couldn't find until they chose to reveal themselves. American carriers struck like lightning from clear skies. We would scramble fighters to intercept bombers that were already departing. By the time we reached attack altitude, the enemy was beyond our range, returning to carriers we couldn't locate." The fundamental problem lay in Japanese assumptions about the nature of carrier warfare itself. Naval planners had studied American carrier operations during peacetime exercises and concluded that these ships were valuable but predictable assets that would operate according to conventional naval doctrine. They would approach targets from logical directions, maintain formation integrity, and conduct operations that balanced offensive capability with defensive security. American carrier commanders, however, had developed operational concepts that abandoned conventional wisdom in favor of maximum striking power and tactical surprise. Task Force commanders like Admiral William Halsey and Admiral Raymond Spruance demonstrated willingness to accept risks that Japanese planners considered reckless in exchange for achieving complete tactical surprise. This calculated recklessness proved devastatingly effective against defensive systems designed to counter conventional naval approaches. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft patrolled areas where logic suggested enemy carriers should appear. Radar installations monitored approaches that naval doctrine indicated were most likely. Intelligence analysts predicted American movements based on patterns that made strategic sense according to established naval theory. American carrier commanders, however, operated according to principles that prioritized results over doctrine, surprise over safety, and innovation over tradition. They launched aircraft from positions Japanese strategists considered impossible, coordinated attacks across distances that exceeded theoretical operational limits, and achieved tactical objectives through methods that contradicted everything naval warfare experts considered sound practice. The Doolittle Raid of April 18, 1942, represented the ultimate demonstration of American willingness to abandon conventional limitations. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's proposal to launch Army Air Force bombers from a Navy aircraft carrier violated every principle of sensible military planning. The B-25 Mitchell bombers were too large for carrier operations, too heavy for the flight deck, and lacked the range to return to friendly bases after attacking Japan. Yet on that April morning, 16 bombers rose from the deck of USS Hornet, 650 miles from the Japanese coast, carrying out an attack that Japanese homeland defense planners had calculated was physically impossible. The psychological impact exceeded the minimal physical damage. If American aircraft could appear over Tokyo without warning, what other impossible attacks might follow? Japanese radar operators scanning the eastern approaches to the home islands had detected nothing. The handful of primitive early warning stations protecting Japan's coastline operated on frequencies and at power levels that couldn't penetrate beyond a few dozen miles. American carriers launching aircraft 400 miles offshore remained completely. More devastating still was the reasonable accuracy, but they had failed to anticipalization that American operational planning had achieved invisible to Japanese detection systems, designed for the conventional threats, had tracked American carrier movements in the Pacific with complete strategic surprise. Japanese intelligence services platforms for land-based bombers. The attack that carriers could be used as launching revealed a flexibility in American thinking that Japanese military planners found deeply disturbing. Admiral Yamamoto's immediate response demonstrated how profoundly the Doolittle Raid had shaken Japanese strategic confidence. Despite ongoing fighter groups to remain in Japan for operations across the Pacific, he ordered 4 homeland defense. These aircraft, desperate where Japanese forces faced increasing, greatly needed in combat zones American pressure, instead patrolled Japanese skies against further surprise attacks that might come from any direction. The defensive measures revealed the magnitude of Japan's strategic dilemma. With thousands of miles of Pacific coastline to protect and radar coverage that extended barely beyond visual range, Japanese forces couldn't possibly monitor all potential approach routes for American carrier task forces. Every additional radar station required precious resources. Every fighter group assigned to homeland defense meant fewer aircraft available for offensive operations. Meanwhile, American industrial capacity was producing carrier aircraft at rates that Japanese intelligence analysts dismissed as propaganda. The monthly production figures emerging from American factories seemed to exceed physical possibility. Yet reconnaissance flights over American bases in Hawaii and Australia confirmed that these impossible numbers were accurate. American carrier air groups were growing larger, while Japanese squadrons struggled to replace combat losses. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 provided the decisive demonstration of how American carrier operations had evolved beyond Japanese comprehension. Admiral Nagumo approached the engagement with 4 of Japan's finest aircraft carriers, confident that superior pilot training and proven tactical doctrine would ensure victory. His operational plan followed established procedures that had succeeded in every previous engagement. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft searched the ocean areas where American carriers logically should appear. Radio intercept stations monitored frequencies where enemy communications typically occurred. Intelligence analysts predicted American responses based on strategic logic that had proven reliable in earlier battles. Every element of Japanese preparation followed established doctrine refined through months of successful operations. Yet, when the decisive moment arrived, American dive bombers appeared over the Japanese fleet from an angle that reconnaissance hadn't covered, at a time when defensive fighters were at low altitude, during a period when Japanese carriers were most vulnerable. The timing wasn't accidental. American commanders had coordinated their approach to exploit weaknesses in Japanese defensive procedures that they had studied and understood. The destruction of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in a single day represented more than tactical defeat. It demonstrated that American operational methods had achieved a level of sophistication that rendered Japanese defensive planning obsolete. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had been eliminated not by superior numbers or better equipment, but by tactical coordination that Japanese commanders couldn't anticipate or counter. More devastating than the loss of ships was the destruction of irreplaceable pilots and aircrew. Japan had begun the war with approximately 2,000 highly trained naval aviators, many with years of combat experience. The Pacific battles of 1942 consumed these veterans at rates that Japanese training programs couldn't replace. Each engagement reduced the quality of Japanese reconnaissance and defensive capabilities. American pilot training programs, meanwhile, were producing aviators at unprecedented rates. While individual American pilots might lack the experience of their Japanese counterparts, they operated within tactical systems that emphasized coordination over individual skill. American carriers launched coordinated strikes by dozens of aircraft, guided by radio communications that Japanese forces couldn't intercept or jam effectively. The technological gap in radar and communications equipment widened throughout 1942 as American research and development programs produced increasingly sophisticated detection systems. New radar installations could identify aircraft formations at ranges exceeding 100 miles. Improved radio equipment allowed carrier task force commanders to coordinate operations across vast ocean areas. Japanese technology development, constrained by industrial limitations and strategic priorities focused elsewhere, failed to match American advances. Radar systems that had seemed adequate in early 1942 proved increasingly obsolete as American carrier operations became more sophisticated. Communication equipment that had provided reasonable coordination for Japanese forces became inadequate for detecting and responding to American tactical innovations. By late 1942, Japanese defensive planners faced an impossible situation. American carrier task forces could appear anywhere within a radius of 1,000 miles from potential targets. They could launch attacks from directions that radar couldn't monitor. They could coordinate strikes with timing that made defensive responses ineffective. Most critically, they could disappear before Japanese surface forces could mount counterattacks. The strategic implications extended far beyond individual battles. Japan's entire defensive perimeter strategy depended on early warning systems that could provide adequate notice of approaching enemy forces. When American carriers could penetrate these defenses undetected, the perimeter became meaningless. Every Japanese base, every supply convoy, every strategic installation within carrier aircraft range became vulnerable to surprise attack. Japanese naval commanders found themselves fighting a war for which their training and doctrine had never prepared them. They had mastered conventional naval tactics, but American carriers operated according to principles that violated conventional wisdom. Traditional naval engagements occurred when opposing fleets chose to fight. American carriers imposed combat on Japanese forces at times and places of American choosing. The psychological pressure on Japanese pilots and commanders intensified with each successful American attack. These men had trained extensively for aerial combat, but their preparation assumed they would engage enemy aircraft under circumstances that allowed them to utilize their superior experience and equipment effectively. Instead, they found themselves responding to coordinated attacks by formations that appeared without warning and struck with devastating precision. The mathematical certainty of Japanese defeat was being written in production statistics that naval commanders couldn't comprehend. While Japanese shipyards struggled to replace a single aircraft carrier lost in battle, American industrial capacity was launching new fleet carriers every few months. The USS Essex, commissioned in December 1942, represented not just naval construction, but a revolution in carrier design that incorporated lessons learned from early Pacific engagements. These new American carriers entered service with radar systems that could detect aircraft formations at distances Japanese technology couldn't match. Flight decks designed for rapid aircraft handling allowed launch and recovery operations that exceeded anything Japanese carriers could achieve. Most critically, they carried air groups trained in coordinated attack methods that Japanese defensive doctrine couldn't counter effectively. The Essex-class carriers joined existing American task forces with capabilities that transformed Pacific naval warfare. Unlike earlier carriers that operated individually or in pairs, these ships functioned as components of integrated task forces containing multiple carriers, escort vessels, and supply ships. The coordination required to manage such formations exceeded anything Japanese naval planners had considered possible. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, demonstrated operational methods that rendered Japanese defensive calculations meaningless. His carrier formations could maintain position hundreds of miles from targets while launching successive waves of aircraft that arrived over Japanese bases with timing that overwhelmed defensive responses. The coordination required multiple carriers launching aircraft simultaneously, navigating to targets along different routes, and arriving over enemy positions within minutes of each other. Japanese radar operators watching their primitive detection screens couldn't distinguish between natural interference and approaching American aircraft formations until attackers were already overhead. The early warning systems that had seemed adequate for detecting large bomber formations proved useless against carrier aircraft approaching at low altitude from multiple directions simultaneously. Wing Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most experienced naval aviation officers, analyzed American carrier operations with growing despair. His classified reports to the Naval General Staff described tactical capabilities that contradicted everything Japanese doctrine assumed about carrier limitations. The Americans coordinate attacks by hundreds of aircraft across distances that should make such coordination impossible. They appear over our bases from directions our reconnaissance cannot cover. Most disturbing, they achieve tactical surprise against defenders who know attacks are coming. The fundamental problem extended beyond individual battles to encompass Japan's entire strategic position. The defensive perimeter that had seemed impregnable in early 1942 depended on early warning systems that could provide adequate notice of approaching enemy forces. American carriers, however, operated beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft while remaining within striking distance of critical targets. Every major Japanese naval base, every strategic installation, every supply convoy within 400 miles of open ocean became vulnerable to surprise attack by carrier aircraft that could appear without warning. Japanese defensive planners found themselves trying thousands to protect of miles of coastline and hundreds of strategic targets against an enemy whose operational methods they couldn't predict or counter. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 provided the ultimate demonstration of how completely American carrier operations had evolved beyond Japanese comprehension. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa approached the engagement with 9 aircraft carriers and embarked 473 CAD aircraft, confident that superior pilot training and core victory against dynated tactics would achieve American forces. Ozawa's operational plan followed established Japanese doctrine refined through years of successful operations. His carriers would launch coordinated strikes against American task forces while maintaining formation integrity and defensive capability. Japanese pilots, despite reduced training time, retained superior individual skills that should compensate for American numerical advantages. The reality proved catastrophically different. American radar systems detected Japanese aircraft formations while they were still climbing to attack altitude, providing defensive fighters with perfect positioning for interception. American pilots, operating with coordination that Japanese commanders couldn't achieve, destroyed Japanese attack formations before they could reach their targets. More devastating still was the American counterattack. Task Force 58 launched strikes by over 200 aircraft that appeared over Japanese carriers from multiple directions simultaneously. The coordination required launching aircraft from 15 different carriers, navigating across hundreds of miles of ocean, and arriving over targets with timing that overwhelmed Japanese defensive capabilities. Japanese pilots attempting to defend their carriers found themselves facing coordinated attacks by formations larger than anything their training had prepared them to counter. American dive bombers appeared overhead while torpedo planes approached at sea level and fighters swept from the sky. The tactical coordination defensive aircraft exceeded anything Japanese doctrine considered achievable. The destruction was swift and complete. In what American pilots would call the Great Marianas turkey shoot, Japanese carrier aviation lost approximately 400 aircraft and their irreplaceable pilots in a single day. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk, and the remainder retreated with decimated air groups that could no longer conduct effective operations. Admiral Ozawa's after-action report captured the magnitude of Japanese tactical obsolescence. American carrier operations demonstrate capabilities our doctrine never anticipated. They coordinate attacks by hundreds of aircraft with precision that exceeds our theoretical calculations. Their defensive systems detect our approaches while we remain blind to theirs. We are fighting an enemy whose methods render our training and experience irrelevant. The technological gap had widened beyond Japanese ability to close through conventional development. American radar installations could detect aircraft formations at ranges exceeding 150 miles under favorable conditions. Communication systems allowed coordination between carriers separated by hundreds of miles. Most critically, American industrial capacity was producing sophisticated electronic equipment at rates that Japanese factories couldn't match. Japanese radar development, constrained by material shortages and competing priorities, struggled to field systems that matched American capabilities from 2 years earlier. The few advanced detection installations protecting critical targets operated with reliability problems and maintenance requirements that strained technical resources. Coverage remained spotty, and coordination between installations poor. Meanwhile, American carrier task forces operated with electronic warfare capabilities that Japanese forces couldn't counter. Radar jamming equipment disrupted Japanese defensive coordination. Radio intercept systems provided intelligence about Japanese movements and intentions. Electronic countermeasures reduced the effectiveness of Japanese radar-guided anti-aircraft weapons. The strategic situation became hopeless for Japanese defensive planners. American carrier task forces could appear anywhere within a 1,000-mile radius of potential targets, launch coordinated attacks capabilities, and withdraw before Japanese counter for that overwhelmed defensive seas could respond effectively. Every Japanese installation within carrier aircraft range faced constant threat of surprise attack. Japanese fighter squadrons assigned to defensive duties found themselves responding to attacks that had already achieved their objectives by the time defensive aircraft reached intercept altitude. American carrier aircraft struck with such speed and coordination that effective defense became impossible. The superior individual skills of Japanese pilots became irrelevant when they couldn't engage enemy aircraft under circumstances that allowed those skills to be utilized effectively. By early 1945, American carrier operations had achieved a level of sophistication that rendered Japanese defensive efforts futile. Task Force 58, operating with 17 fleet carriers and thousands of embarked aircraft, could maintain position off the Japanese coast while launching continuous attacks against homeland targets. The scale of operations exceeded anything Japanese planners had considered possible when they designed their defensive systems. The radar installations protecting Japanese coastal areas could detect some incoming attacks, but the warning time proved inadequate for effective response. American aircraft appeared over targets within minutes of detection, struck with overwhelming force, and departed before Japanese fighters could mount coordinated counterattacks. The defensive system designed to protect against conventional bomber raids proved useless against carrier aircraft operating with tactical flexibility. Japanese industrial targets, military installations, and transportation networks faced systematic destruction by carrier aircraft that could appear from any direction at any time. The unpredictability of American operations made defensive planning impossible. Resources allocated to protect one target left others vulnerable. Fighter squadrons positioned to defend against attacks from one direction found themselves out of position when strikes came from unexpected vectors. The final irony lay in the realization that Japan's early success at Pearl Harbor had created the very threat that would destroy them. The attack had eliminated American battleships while leaving carriers intact, forcing American naval commanders to develop operational methods that maximized carrier effectiveness. Those methods, refined through years of Pacific combat, had evolved into tactical capabilities that Japanese defensive systems couldn't counter. Admiral Nagumo, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood this bitter truth as American carriers launched devastating strikes against Japanese positions throughout 1944 and 1945. The surprise attack that had seemed so decisive in December 1941 had merely delayed American retaliation, while ensuring that when it came, it would arrive with overwhelming force, delivered by methods Japanese defenses couldn't anticipate or counter effectively. The systematic destruction of Japanese naval aviation continued through the summer of 1944, as American carrier task forces demonstrated operational capabilities that reduced Japanese defensive planning to desperate improvisation. Task Force 58, now multiple carrier groups, could maintain continuous operating with unprecedented coordination between combat operations while rotating air groups to prevent pilot fatigue and aircraft wear. This sustained operational tempo exceeded anything Japanese forces could match or counter effectively. Japanese intelligence services, struggling with communication breakdowns and resource shortages, found themselves unable to track American carrier movements with any reliability. The sophisticated radio intercept networks that had provided valuable intelligence during earlier phases of the war proved inadequate against American communication security measures that had evolved dramatically since 1942. Electronic warfare capabilities aboard American ships jammed Japanese monitoring stations while providing false signals that misled defensive planners about task force positions and intentions. The technological disparity became most apparent in night operations, where American radar-equipped aircraft could conduct precision attacks against Japanese targets in complete darkness. Japanese defensive doctrine had never adequately addressed the threat of nocturnal carrier strikes, assuming that such operations were too dangerous to conduct regularly. American pilots, however, trained extensively for night combat using radar and radio navigation systems that allowed them to locate targets and coordinate attacks in conditions where Japanese defenders couldn't see approaching aircraft until bombs were already falling. These night attacks proved particularly devastating because they caught Japanese forces during periods when defensive alertness was naturally reduced. Air raid warning systems designed for daylight operations provided inadequate coverage during darkness. Fighter squadrons struggled to intercept attackers they couldn't visually identify until too late. Ground crews working to repair damage from previous raids found themselves under attack again before restoration work could be completed. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the remnants of Japanese carrier forces, submitted increasingly desperate reports to the Naval General Staff throughout the summer of 1944. His assessments revealed the complete breakdown of Japanese ability to contest American carrier operations effectively. American task forces operate with impunity within sight of our coastal installations. They launch attacks at will, while our reconnaissance aircraft cannot locate their positions until they choose to reveal themselves. Our defensive fighters arrive over targets after American aircraft have departed. We are fighting blind against an enemy who sees everything. The industrial statistics supporting American carrier operations had reached levels that Japanese planners found impossible to comprehend. American shipyards were launching new fleet carriers faster than Japanese forces could sink them, while simultaneously producing the escort carriers, destroyers, cruisers, and supply vessels required to support these massive task forces. Each new American carrier entered service with electronic equipment more sophisticated than anything protecting Japanese homeland installations. Japanese aircraft production, meanwhile, struggled to replace combat losses while maintaining quality standards that would allow effective operations against American forces. The shortage of experienced pilots forced training programs to reduce instruction time to dangerously low levels. New Japanese pilots arrived at operational squadrons with fewer than 100 hours of flight experience, compared to American aviators who received over 300 hours of training before entering combat zones. The qualitative gap in pilot capabilities combined with technological disadvantages in aircraft performance created a situation where Japanese defensive efforts became increasingly futile. American carrier aircraft equipped with superior radios could coordinate attacks with precision that Japanese pilots couldn't match even when they achieved tactical surprise. American fighters with better engines and armament dominated air-to-air combat, while American dive bombers and torpedo planes struck with accuracy that Japanese defensive doctrine had never anticipated. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 demonstrated the complete collapse of Japanese ability to contest American carrier operations through conventional naval engagement. Admiral Takeo Kurita approached the engagement with the most powerful surface fleet Japan could assemble, including the massive battleships Yamamoto and Musashi, confident that superior gunnery would overwhelm American carrier task forces in surface combat. The reality proved catastrophically different from Japanese expectations. American carrier aircraft detected Kurita's approaching fleet while it was still hundreds of miles from potential targets, providing task force commanders with perfect intelligence about Japanese strength, composition, and intentions. Coordinated strikes by over 400 carrier aircraft overwhelmed Japanese defensive capabilities before the surface fleet could close to gun range. The sinking of Musashi by carrier aircraft demonstrated the futility of Japanese hopes that superior armor and firepower could protect their ships from American air attack. Despite carrying the heaviest defensive armament ever installed on a warship, the mighty battleship succumbed to coordinated torpedo and bomb attacks delivered with precision that rendered defensive fire ineffective. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese naval officers proved as devastating as the physical destruction. Japanese submarine operations, which had achieved some success during earlier phases of the war, found themselves increasingly ineffective against American carrier task forces equipped with sophisticated sonar systems and coordinated anti-submarine warfare capabilities. American destroyer escorts, specifically designed for submarine hunting, provided protection that made successful attacks against carriers extremely difficult. The few Japanese submarines that managed to penetrate American defensive screens discovered that torpedo attacks against fast-moving, maneuvering carriers required tactical skills their crews hadn't developed. The strategic implications extended beyond individual naval engagements to encompass Japan's entire position in the Pacific War. With American carrier task forces operating freely within striking distance of the Japanese home islands, every strategic target became vulnerable to attack without warning. Japanese industrial production, already strained by material shortages and bombing damage, faced systematic destruction by carrier aircraft that could appear over any target at any time. Japanese civilian morale, which had remained relatively stable through earlier defeats, began cracking under the psychological pressure of constant air raid alerts that might or might not precede actual attacks. The unpredictability of American carrier operations meant that defensive preparations had to be maintained continuously, disrupting industrial production and civilian life. Workers assigned to anti-aircraft duties couldn't maintain full production schedules. Resources devoted to air raid shelters and defensive installations reduced materials available for military equipment. The command structure coordinating Japanese defensive efforts struggled with communication problems that American electronic warfare made increasingly severe. Radio jamming disrupted coordination between radar installations, fighter squadrons, and command headquarters. American intercept operations provided detailed intelligence about Japanese defensive preparations while Japanese intelligence services remained largely blind to American intentions and capabilities. The transformation was complete and irreversible. What began as Japan's moment of greatest triumph at Pearl Harbor had evolved into their most catastrophic strategic miscalculation. By awakening American industrial might while leaving carrier forces intact, the attack had created the very weapon system that would systematically dismantle Japanese defensive capabilities across the Pacific. American carrier task forces operating with technological sophistication and tactical coordination that Japanese planners had never imagined possible proved that naval warfare had fundamentally changed. The age of predictable fleet engagements was over, replaced by an era where superior industrial capacity, advanced electronics, and innovative tactics could project devastating power across vast ocean distances without warning. Japan's inability to anticipate, detect, or counter these revolutionary carrier operations sealed their fate, demonstrating that in modern warfare, the side that could appear anywhere while remaining invisible to enemy detection systems would achieve victory through methods that rendered traditional naval doctrine obsolete.